Dear guests, speakers, friends of Fritt Ord and the New York Review of Books, it's a great privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Trustees of Fritt Ord to this, the last of a series of meetings and conferences in New York, London, Paris, and here in Oslo. We have cherished our collaboration, and we are more than pleased to once again host scholars from 2 continents to discuss challenges central to today's society: multiculturalism, migration, citizenship, free speech. These issues are of more than academic interest, painfully and dramatically experienced both in New York and in Oslo through the now iconic dates 9/11, 2001 and the 22nd of July, 2011. But multiculturalism can and should also be discussed way beyond these extraordinary atrocities. It is our sincere hope that this conference will contribute to a more general and open public debate on the often emotional and contentious issues related to our themes. Hans Magnus Enzensberger began the Große Wanderung, the Great Migration from the 90s, with a metaphor borrowed from meteorology. The normal state of the atmosphere is turbulence. Mankind's normal state is mobility, and mobility often generates tension and conflict. Mobility and conflict, on the other hand, often provide food for change and innovation. And our time is no exception. As we have entered a new century, international migration is a key issue in the Western world, one marked by turbulence, politically, socially, culturally. We've seen maps of Europe with fat and skinny arrows entering from all over the world. These arrows represent streams of people on the move, all destined for today's promised land. And we've seen television programs about irregular migration, human beings in border areas in the middle of the night trying to escape the technology of modern gatekeeping. In the cold northern periphery of Europe, Norway is part of this picture, although this has been reluctantly realized over the last 40 years. In the realm of migration, Norway used to be a sending country. Its exodus to the United States during the last half of the 19th and 2 decades into the 20th century have ranked prominently in people's perception. 1/4 of Norway's population emigrated. Sometimes they left property behind, but more often poverty, and always memories, friends, and family members. This passage to the States holds an almost poetic status in Norway's history. It has been reflected and reproduced through dramas, novels, photo collections, and musical pieces. Students of this overseas migration may find striking similarities and important differences to modern migration into Norway and Europe at large. In Bloody Foreigners on British immigration, Robert Winder makes a point that emigrants generally have a more dashing status than immigrants. Heading out is adventurous, courageous, and entrepreneurial. Coming in is insecure, incompetent, dependent, and demanding. Emigration connotes excitement, immigration, disappointment. But with today's international migration, this image needs to be nuanced. Immigration comes from all social and cultural backgrounds and from most corners of the world. And the context into which they enter vary as much. The USA and Norway thus represents highly different receiving societies in today's migration complex. One thing has been beyond discussion among researchers of migration in Scandinavia. Comparisons with America's immigration policies has been seen as futile. The United States was founded on immigration and diversity, and this composed one of its constituting myths, part of a proud self-presentation. Until recently, Scandinavian authorities have emphasized homogeneity and sameness as the glue of society. Furthermore, the magnitude of immigration to the US did not call for comparison with Scandinavia's, until recently, more modest flows. And besides, America's more clear-cut market-oriented approach was not seen as comparable to the Scandinavian more softer welfare enterprise. Replacing the solidaristic achievements of the Scandinavian model with the individualism of the American system associated with insecurity and inequality seemed out of question. Recently, a more nuanced perspective has crept into research and into public discussion. Two factors in particular have played a role. The open attitude towards difference, including religious affiliation, that seemed to have eased the process of adjustment for America's newcomers, and the emphasis on immigrants as self-reliant persons who are to be absorbed by the labor market without substantive support through public welfare. These factors contrast some of the more salient structural challenges of the Scandinavian and the Norwegian immigration regime today. The theme of this conference can serve as an umbrella for some of the most intense, most contentious questions of our time. How are states to forge a new or renewed societal foundation to uphold treasured liberal democratic values, social welfare, and possibly a sense of bounded belonging in a context increasingly marked by people's diverse loyalties and lifestyle preferences? This basic challenge is relevant on both sides of the Atlantic. But what is multiculturalism? The term is slippery. It refers to a whole series of approaches, how we handle difference and questions of identity and values, how we see pluralism combined with the ethos of equality, and how we deal with group rights as opposed to individual rights. It can be a descriptive term, but more often it's a normative concept dealing with the principle that various cultures can and should coexist within a particular region, that immigrants or national minorities have the right to preserve original culture, to increase their sense of recognition and belonging. And to a certain contestable degree, they should receive public support in doing so. Multiculturalism has been associated with cultural relativism. It pertains to culture, but in practice, the approaches have dealt with a bundle of dimensions. The multicultural discourse has been embedded differently in North America than in Europe and Scandinavia. In the US, the race question has been central and largely amounts to remedial action directed towards discriminated insiders of the national community. In Canada, it has been more a question of national minorities wanting to sustain their group's identity within a historical homeland with separate institutional structures. In Europe, the discourse has been more related to the so-called new immigration, aiming at equality-based incorporation into the receiving societies. And this difference is reflected in the distinctions of nationhood. Roughly speaking, in Europe, immigration and traditional nationhood are seen as in conflict, whereas in North America, immigrants are considered an integral part of nationhood. The United States was the home of the assimilation theory of the 1920s. Newcomers were expected to mold naturally into the culture of the traditionally dominant Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. Later in the 20th century, social scientists criticized the perceived pressure to assimilate. What should change was not people's identity, but the dominant majority culture itself. This shift in discourse is illustrated by the change of metaphor from melting pot to ethnic mosaic. As early as 1963, seminal books like Nathan Glaser and Daniel Moynihan's Beyond the Melting Pot turned the tide by stressing the remarkable resilience of immigrant cultures and refuting the predictions of the dominant assimilation theory as to cultural absorption and Anglo-conformity. The ideology of multiculturalism, often presented in tandem with the term integration in Scandinavia, was a direct response to the criticism of forced assimilation, even in the Nordic context. Although multicultural immigration was rather new in the 1970s, a homogenization policy had been implemented after the Second World War that included a rather forceful, intentional streamlining of the few existing minorities. Integration, spelled out as an active policy, explicitly opposed ideas of assimilation. It was supposed to break away from this tradition by emphasizing a more liberal approach, embodying human rights and cultural pluralism. In the beginning, the new policy was basically negatively defined. It was not assimilation, and the notion of free choice played a central role. After some time, the policy developed more positive content, with new ways of understanding relations between the majority and minorities. From one angle, the notion of integration has met the criticism that beneath the official ideology, integration is actually a euphemism for a de facto demand for assimilation. That is, the kind of differences the majority is prepared to accept are rather superficial. From another and more recent angle, the authorities are also criticized for being too lenient, particularly about traditions that oppress women. Anyhow, the long-term goals of the strategy is unclear. Should the multicultural society with its concessions to group rights be a lasting structure, or is it just a station on the road to an ethnically multiplex society without minority formations? Is thus integration just a postponement of a long-term assimilation project? 40 years after the integration policies or multiculturalism entered Europe, many European receiving countries are in the midst of a process of self-scrutiny. What is conceived as discouraging results have made the central actors review the basic premises of the established thinking. Although there is significant variation, some minority groups are highly marginalized economically and socially, and occasionally there are signs of social inheritance, in which the second and third generations reproduce the problems of the first. Its causes are often difficult to identify, but it has generated political responses moving in the same direction. More restrictive approaches to minority cultures, stronger emphasis on majority values, and differentiating social rights. In the US, questions of inclusion, exclusion, and race relations constitute a vast literature. New subtleties and voices assert the de facto ongoing assimilation of minorities in American society. America's dirty little secret, as Richard Alba and Victor Nee pointedly labeled it 10 years ago. Other scholars say that assimilation is not necessarily wrong. It does happen through the gravitation of time and through the processes in which a myriad of individuals interplay with society's structural forces. It can be a reflection of healthy adjustment, social mobility, and personal choice and aspirations, yet also of pure necessity, discrimination, or societal pressure. The field has opened up in many ways. Social assimilation has been recognized as highly contingent and also segmented. It depends on combined factors such as class, skills, economic context, institutional structures, and geography. Should the adjustment of newcomers then be a private concern or a public responsibility? Europe and Scandinavia have tended to use explicit integration policies to varying degrees. In the United States, the market and civil society are supposed to do the job. Although, even in the US, the picture is more nuanced. America's affirmative action program is radical, even seen through Scandinavian eyes. Positive discrimination of minorities to smooth their way into work or educational institutions. This leaves us with an interesting puzzle. The attribution of special benefits or privileges based on group membership in the US goes much further than any proactive policy undertaken by the otherwise governance-oriented Scandinavian states. Nevertheless, in both contexts, in the public and in academia, focus has gradually shifted from a rights-oriented multicultural perspective to one more conflict and dilemma, civil citizenship-oriented. Despite the obvious political and institutional differences of the labor market welfare nexus between the US and Norway, both countries struggle with weakening civic engagement, cultural conflicts, and challenges to social cohesion. In Norway, the debate has centered on sustaining support for the welfare model and on conflicts related to religion and gender equality, but increasingly on freedom of speech under more culturally complex conditions. In the US, the school system has gone further in adjusting curricula to a multicultural situation, to a degree where some talk in terms of a Balkanization of American education. We hear worries about the role of schools in generating civil citizenship and cultural reproduction, when central institutions are being fragmented according to race, ethnicity, religion, and not least people's wallets. Similar concern is expressed in the university system. According to the late historian Tony Judt, well known from the New York Review of Books, and I quote, "Multiculturalism created lots of micro-constituencies, which universities didn't have the courage to oppose. It's like a supermarket. Students can take whatever courses they want. Jewish students study Jewish studies, gay students take gay studies, and black students African American studies. You no longer have a university, but a series of identity constituencies all studying themselves," unquote. In Europe, even though one may question whether multiculturalism ever actually materialized to a large extent, it has recently come under political attack from both left and right. It has been declared dead and useless by Europe's leading politicians, and in more academic circles, certain interpretations of assimilation theory has been reinvigorated. Increasingly, multiculturalism is seen as encouraging people to live separate lives. Subsidized isolation, we might call it in Scandinavia. Rainbow underclass is suggested in the US. The British head of the Commission for Racial Equality, Trevor Phillips, calls it sleepwalking into segregation. So why are we paying attention to this wide concept, multiculturalism? Are we flogging a dead horse? Not surprisingly, our answer is no. Regardless of the inconsistencies, the indistinctness, and the dogmatism, what it refers to, beyond the public noise, reflects real dilemmas, real challenges. There is an unsettled contradiction in modern liberal democracies. Exclusive ideas of the nation-state versus inclusive ideas of universal human and civil rights. Equal treatment versus differential treatment. The right to be different versus the right to be similar. The Austrian political scientist Rainer Bauböck asked, if multiculturalism was the wrong answer, what was the question? I think the shortcut question is, how can we build societal or generalized trust today in a much more culturally complex world than what we have been used to, at least in Scandinavia? It is about what Tocqueville called the slow and silent processes where society acts upon itself. It will involve enrichment, yet also conflict and turbulence. Welcome again and enjoy the conference.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Silvers, editor of the New York Review of Books. I want to say what a pleasure it is to be here again in Oslo with our fellow sponsors, the Fritt Ord organization. They've been marvelous in organizing this conference. We're very grateful to them. We're grateful to you for coming. Now, just thinking about our conference today as an editor, not as an expert, I recalled three statements that seem relevant, three statements that would be on my mind as an editor. The first was an essay on nationalism by Isaiah Berlin. It was written 40 years ago, in 1972, when the poorer countries and the former colonial countries, he wrote, and I'm only summarizing him here, the desire to be treated as equals, as full human beings, often takes the form of self-assertion of one form of nationalism or another. An assertion that seeks liberty of action and determination of its own life. It can be large, it can be small, it can be regional, it can be linguistic. Today it is likely to be collective and national, or it is likely to be ethnic and religious. So Berlin wrote in 1972 an assertion of ancient faith against the modern. Now, Berlin, not for the first time, called attention to the fact that the apparent triumph of scientific rationalism, of the great 18th century movements, away from ignorance, away from superstition and the vagaries of natural forces, and the triumph, as well as the cultures of individualism and of technocratic, organized economic civilization, have sometimes imposed a yoke that, he wrote, can in its turn have evoked an intensely human cry for independence from its rule. It is, he wrote, a cry for independence in which men seek to realize their natures, free from coercion by masters, bullies, bosses, and dominations of various kinds. And Berlin, in his writings, insisted that any concept of the future that failed to take account of the variegated powers of nationalism, whether in Western societies that prematurely believed they had transcended it, or in developing societies for whom the different forms of nationalism represent both a hope for freedom they may attain and the resentment and the feelings of revenge of an insulted humanity. Now, whatever one may think of Berlin's views of 40 years ago, it contains a message that seems to me worth bearing in mind in any discussion. The desire, as he put it, of the inflamed consciousness that is insufficiently regarded, the desire to count as something more in the cultures and cities of the world. Now, one purpose of the conference is, I believe, to consider both the positive and also the negative futures of this something more. Our second statement is very different. It comes to some 22 years ago, 20 years after Berlin wrote. That was the time when the IMF was concerned to define globalization, the very word of that moment, the word that was on the lips of every columnist. They commissioned a report trying to define what it was. And it dealt, very predictably, with increases in trade and transactions across borders and their increase, and with the enormous increase in transfers of capital and transactions across borders, the increase in transfers, investments, often by multinational corporations that establish branches abroad. But crucially for our purposes, it traced the rise in migration, in movements of people. Just between 1965 and 1990, it said, there were more than 200 million migrants around the world, and they were from many developing countries to less developed countries, and many, many to the more advanced countries. Now, there were, in those IMF reports of 20 years ago, very optimistic claims that the flow of migrants to advanced countries would, and I quote, provide a means by which global wages would converge and skills would be transferred in large quantities back to developing countries as wages in the new countries grew. This was the heyday of hopes for globalization and migration, and of the assumed integration of immigrants. Now, those conclusions have been very vigorously modified, challenged. What seems clear is that any discussion of multiculturalism must confront not just the status quo of different immigrant groups and cultures in European and American cities, but the continuing flow of people from the poorer world, notwithstanding the attitudes that Isaiah Berlin described and the conditions of unemployment and exploitation and resentment that many will face. We're lucky to have here scholars who can help us understand this continuing and growing quintessential phenomenon. Now, finally, for many in Europe who have heard in America, who have heard incessantly about urban crime from immigrant groups. In the recent book on crime in the U.S. by the sociologist Franklin Zimring, he wrote about New York City, in which some 38% of my fellow citizens there are described as foreign-born. And here I quote him when I say that one aspect of the population composition that may well modify the rates of crime associated with ethnic and social groups is how recently the members of these groups that have arrived have developed in New York into a self-reliant group with the capacity and ambition to make a transition to a new country. And typically, this first generation has lower rates of arrest and other measures of criminality that not only of other generations of the same group, but of many other groups. The arrival of a significant number of new immigrants was one feature, Mr. Zimmerling wrote, of New York City in the mid-90s that has been suggested as a reason for New York's very encouraging crime trends, which have been lower and lower during that time. This, he writes, may be an important feature of the New York City difference, the New York City advantage. Now, we will hear today of the organized forces of jihadi terror that plague parts of our cities across Europe, across Asia, and that try to threaten the state itself and deserve the closest attention and the most strategic sense of defense. But here there is also a hypothesis with strong evidence that the familiar insistent complaint against new immigrants population can be seen differently. And it shows them in one of the most important places in the world as forces of social peace. What is clear is that cliches about immigration and multiculturalism must be examined and resisted and tested. And that is what we're here to do. And now, the first session will be opened here on the patterns of migration, and I leave the floor to Professor Hyland Eriksson of the University of Oslo. Thank you.